Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gamer Telecom video, we're going to be discussing recent news that Rackspace are now working alongside Sony with their Openstack private cloud. So in this video, we're going to be discussing a little bit about Rackspace and OpenCloud, as well as the piece of news and what it actually means for Sony. So this piece of news was actually brought to my attention by a couple of people on Facebook, on the RedGamingTech.com Facebook page, which is of course facebook.com/RedGamingTech, and a couple of people actually messaged me asking my opinion on this, and I decided it would be probably better and more efficient just to release a video on it. So before we get too far into this, let's actually discuss a little bit more back to basics. Now, Sony have already mentioned, or more specifically, Mark Cerny has already mentioned that the PlayStation, the PS4, should I say, can do very much like the Xbox One. It could use cloud-based computing technology to basically supplement its processing power. But Mark Cerny has, I wouldn't say categorically said that he doesn't like the idea, but he has said that he's not very convinced of it, and so far he doesn't really think that the implementation is worth it. But there are definitely benefits to cloud-based computing. For example, cloud saves, the Gaikai cloud game streaming, which is another thing we'll talk about in a moment, as well as, of course, cheap servers to host multiplayer gaming, and even content delivery networks and ways to actually send data and games that you've purchased, of course, to, well, you. Because obviously, if you've just purchased a game, you don't want to be downloading it like, 100 kilobytes a second. You want a good fast connection. Ideally, you would like it to max out your internet connection, whatever speed your internet connection is. In other words, you would like it to be sending data as fast as possible. Of course, that's not the only purpose of all of this. It's also to track things such as achievements, or should I say trophies, what people are doing online, messages to people, voice chat, and a lot more besides. And so Lanham Napier, I'm hoping I've pronounced that, he is the CEO of Rackspace. I'm going to give you guys a spelling for that. That is Lanham, and then Napier, Napier, was speaking in an earnings call, and he has now said that Sony are an enterprise-level customer. This is the quote: Sony PlayStation recently signed a service agreement with Rackspace, under which our developers and architects will be consulting and supporting PlayStation team with the OpenStack private cloud deployment. We are the founder and key leader of OpenStack cloud ecosystems, and we are the leader in providing OpenStack-based private clouds. So, who exactly created OpenStack, what is OpenStack, and what are its purposes? Well, we've spoken a lot about the purposes previously. It's going to be a very scalable architecture. Now, I have done a video on cloud computing before. You guys can check that out. It's primarily aimed at, well, Xbox, and I do need to do a follow-up video to speak more about VMs and a few other bits and pieces, but you guys can check that out if you're curious, as some of it is applicable, of course, to the PlayStation as well. Now, as for who's behind it, who's created, who's founded it, it's actually by Rackspace and by NASA. It supports tasks like, for example, compute, object storage, as well as redundancy. Of course, it even supports things such as various backups and image restoration for servers. And all of this redundancy and security, of course, is very important to any service level provider, which of course Sony are going to become with the PlayStation 4. For example, with object storage, let's say that you have a server and the hard drive fails on that server. So, in other words, the server's fine, but the hard drive dies. Well, OpenStack, the actual software, can replicate the contents from other nodes in that same cluster. So, in other words, it somewhat self-heals itself. This is great to help prevent outages. For example, if something goes down, then obviously it's going to maintain a more smoother operating. Now, of course, there are a couple of types of cloud. There's the public type of cloud and there's the private type of cloud, which Sony are going to be pushing for. Now, the private cloud itself can be either held in your own data center. Let's say, for example, you are Sony, then you can actually, the software can be run on your existing servers. And those servers with this software can all amalgamate together and provide a service. Or, of course, it could be run in, say, Rackspace's servers themselves. Now, the major selling point here is that if you have large compute tasks, if you have massive storage requirements, if you have to really control, for example, security, then that's where this comes in, because a lot of this is very scalable. You can switch on servers, you can allocate more servers to a specific task. And think about it just for a moment. Think about just all the tasks at the PlayStation Network. And of course, Xbox as well, but they've got Xur, so we won't talk about that too much for a moment. Just think about all the tasks that the PlayStation Network needs to do. Just when your average game session, let's say you're playing X, whatever X title is, say Call of Duty. First of all, it needs to let you sign in to the PlayStation Network when you first go online. It then needs to tell you what friends you actually have online. Then it needs to be able to allow you to invite those friends, store messages from those friends, and so forth, and get you all into maybe a party chat, set up the server, and a lot more besides. And let's say there's a patch that you need to download, then it needs to send that data from the patch. And all of this is data that's coming to and from the server. And of course, even if you buy a purchase on the PlayStation Network, then you need obviously a secure login and a lot more besides. And of course, Sony have had issues in the past with security. Not that I particularly blame them. I mean, security now is becoming a massive issue. Even companies like Ubisoft, of course, have suffered massive intrusions. And so, what does this all mean? Well, not really that much in my personal opinion. It's just a sign that Sony are getting the right people in. I mean, Rackspace, the people who, well, they are basically one of the key creators of the open cloud, obviously along with NASA, so they've got the technological know-how behind them. But this is just a case of they have the right people, and they are preparing themselves for what lies ahead. We all know that Sony are thinking long-term here for the PlayStation. They are not thinking, 6 months down the line, and that makes sense, because if you're doing a tech project, right, especially in something like this, you can't think to yourself, well, we estimate X amount of users and that's it, because it doesn't really work practically. Instead, what you have to do, of course, is you have to estimate for the initial surge of users, and then you need to plan to how to keep increasing the amount. And one of the benefits, of course, of cloud is that it's completely scalable. In other words, you can, what is known as, spin up another server or another dozen servers or 100 servers, whatever you need to take care of the load. More to the point as well, of course, you always need a little bit of redundancy. And I don't just mean about, well, a server falls over, it dies. We're also talking about times of peak, because obviously usage and everything else will differ. So, for example, let's say you have a European server, say 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. on a Thursday. You can bet that there's a lot more people gaming, for example, in the PlayStation Network than what there is at, say, 2 p.m. on a Monday. It just makes sense. So obviously that's another thing as well. And then, of course, you've got things such as patches, game downloads, of course. And Sony are pushing towards the digital age. They want people to start buying digitally. There's an incentive there. In 2014, in other words, some point next year, in the United States, for example, we're also going to have the Gaikai technology. What the hell is Gaikai? Just for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, well, it's going to allow you to stream over the internet PS3 games to your PS4, just for example. And that's pretty important, because obviously the PS4 lacks backwards compatibility. But having said all of this, it also requires a hell of a lot of compute power. And obviously that's one of the benefits of the open cloud, the compute technology behind it, and the actual distribution of that data. And not just the distribution in terms of sending you the data, it has to be able to do so consistently and, more to the point, with minimal latency, because that's one of the killer issues with cloud-based gaming. I'm still not exactly convinced it's going to work with all games, actually. I think that certain titles, for example, racing games, RPGs, that type of thing, I can expect it to work, but I have a little bit of concern still with titles like, say, God of War and fighting games. But I guess we'll have to see. I suppose it really depends on your location compared to the data center and your internet connection and several other factors as well. But I guess we'll have to just see how that pans out. So I guess the other question is, was Rackspace their best choice? Well, I've mentioned a couple of times that there are several key players, and by no means am I going to list them all in this, but of course you've got Rackspace. Then you've got Amazon with the AWS, and then you've got Microsoft. There are a couple of others, but I'm just going to speak about these. Well, you can't really go with Microsoft because the headlines alone, I mean, could you imagine the headlines? Sony powers their PlayStation Network and whatever else via Windows Azure. It would be, you can't do that. Amazon, of course, have their own Android console that's most likely in the works, and Sony obviously know bits about that, so it doesn't really work with that either. And most likely as well, they feel a lot more confident in Rackspace's engineers. That's not to say that the other companies involved are incompetent or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that Rackspace have a very good history of working with companies to ensure that their cloud and their infrastructure is well in place, and Sony definitely need that. I mean, that's not besmirching Sony's technical expertise at all. It's just to say that the cloud industry, server industry, and everything else is so convoluted, complex, and difficult to really implement in a secure fashion and a scalable fashion. It makes sense to have experts to help you along in this transition, especially in this day and age, because the technology is moving so fast. It's absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, I think that's just about covered any questions that people may have asked or had for this. If you've still got any more, then feel free to ask away on Facebook. So that'll be facebook.com/redgamingtech. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.